Welcome back to Quran by AI. I always say this, but I do love these deep dives, and today we're taking a look at a chapter that's, well, sparked a lot of conversation over the centuries. Chapter 9, Repentance, Al-Tawbah. You know, it's known for being the only chapter that doesn't begin with that familiar phrase, "In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful."
Yeah, that's immediately intriguing, right? And this distinction has actually led to some interesting scholarly debate. Some believe it's because, the chapter kind of delves into these complexities of warfare and political relations, topics not usually associated with that idea of divine mercy.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. It definitely kind of sets a different tone right from the start. From the first verse, you run into that idea of bara. Often it's translated as repudiation, but I feel like that just scratches the surface.
Right, right. There's a lot more to unpack there.
It's more like this declaration, like, we're done with these agreements that aren't working anymore.
Yeah, yeah, like setting some clear boundaries.
And it's specifically aimed at those polytheists who might have, broken treaties with the Muslims. We're talking about groups like the Banu Bakr, Banu Kuza, maybe even the Quraysh.
Yeah, it's like the Quran's laying down the ground rules. Look, even in conflict, there's a right way to do things.
There's got to be some guidelines.
And verse 4 is super clear about that. Breaking a treaty. Okay, but only if the other side isn't holding up their end of the deal. It's not about being merciless, it's about responding when someone's betrayed your trust.
Makes sense. Any relationship, really, you got to have that foundation of trust to move forward.
Absolutely.
But chapter 9 doesn't just stop there. Verse 12, it goes a step further, right? Outlines these specific reasons for going to war.
Like a list of just causes, you could say. If someone breaks an oath, violates an agreement, even if they speak badly about the religion. The Quran's establishing these boundaries, showing what Muslims are and aren't willing to tolerate.
And these aren't just like theoretical examples. They're tied to events that actually happened. Like that attack on the Banu Kuza, a direct violation of the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah, or even the Prophet's own migration from Makkah after, all that persecution.
Yeah.
Both mentioned verse 13.
History coming to life right there in the verses. What I find really interesting, though, is how chapter 9 ties those external conflicts to this inner struggle, this battle against hypocrisy.
Right, like what's going on inside matters just as much.
Yeah, like verse 16, right? Armed struggle becomes this test. It separates the true believers from those who are just putting on a show.
Makes you think, right? What are the tests in our own lives that show our true colors? But okay, let's shift gears a bit. We go from the battlefield to something else entirely. Sacred spaces, specifically mosques. Verses 17-22, they talk about who's in, who's out.
It's complicated, though, isn't it? It's not a simple everyone's welcome kind of thing. There's this prohibition against polytheists maintaining mosques. Even the word maintaining in Arabic, yamuru, people debate what it really means.
Let's see what you mean. Like, is it about serving, inhabiting, or something else?
Exactly. It's tricky.
Like, there's this tension, trying to welcome people, but also preserve the sanctity of these holy places.
Right, right. And it's not just about polytheists either. Verse 31, suggests this might even apply to some Christian groups, ones whose beliefs weren't seen as compatible with Islamic monotheism.
So the lines are being drawn here.
For sure. And even those providing services to the sacred mosque, if their faith's not seen as genuine, well, even they're questioned. It really emphasizes inner belief over outward actions.
It's about what's in your heart, not just showing up.
Yeah.
And speaking of priorities, verses 23-27 tackle a tough one. Putting God above everything, even family, even possessions.
Yeah, no messing around there. Verse 24, straight up warning. Don't let those things come before God and his messenger.
Whoa, it's powerful stuff. Like a wake-up call,
Right.
Remember what really matters. And it's interesting, this idea of putting faith before family, it's not unique to Islam. You see it in the Christian Gospel of Matthew, too.
Oh, for sure. That's a connection that always fascinates me. Different faiths, but a shared understanding of what true commitment looks like.
But sometimes it's not clear who this message is for. Is it just those Muslims in Makkah? Or is it this universal command? The mention of the Battle of Hunayn in verse 25, it adds another layer to think about.
It's like this puzzle, right? Figuring out the historical context, how everything fits together.
Speaking of boundaries, verse 28, we're back to the question of who belongs in sacred spaces. But this time it's even more direct. Idolaters are unclean. They shouldn't even approach the sacred mosque.
That's a strong statement for sure. But what does unclean really mean, right? Is it ritual purity? Or is it more like a metaphor for spiritual impurity? There are so many interpretations out there, and that impacts how this restriction's actually applied.
I can see how that gets complicated.
Yeah, some scholars, they say it's about preventing physical contamination of the Kaaba, the holiest site in Islam. But others take it further. They say ANY mosque, no non-Muslims allowed. It's a debate that's still going on today, shows how differently Muslims interpret and apply their faith.
And then we hit a verse that feels, well, especially relevant right now. Verse 29. This command to fight those who don't follow the religion of truth, especially those who've been given the book.
Yeah, this one, it's definitely sparked a lot of discussion, even controversy. Some scholars connect it to the Tabuk expedition, that military campaign the Prophet led against the Byzantine Empire.
So we're right back in that historical context of religious conflict.
Right. But this verse also introduces this idea of the jizya, that tax on non-Muslims living under Islamic rule.
Oh, the jizya. Can't talk about this chapter without talking about that. Such a controversial topic. Some see it as protection money, others see it as a way for non-Muslims to get out of military service, and then how it should be collected. Verse 29 says, with a willing hand, but even that phrase is open to different interpretations.
Right. Does that mean direct payment? Or is it more about the spirit behind it, like generosity? And then who qualifies for protection under the jizya? Is it all non-Muslims? Are there specific criteria? These are questions that have shaped how different faiths interact for, well, centuries, really.
It's clear this verse, with its themes of religious conflict and, coexistence, it's something people keep coming back to, keep debating.
Yeah.
But chapter 9 doesn't stop challenging us there. Verses 30, 31, they go right to the heart of some theological issues.
Straight up refuting certain beliefs. The Jewish belief in Ezra as the Son of God and the Christian belief in Jesus as the Son of God. Clear statement of theological difference.
It echoes that rejection of polytheism we saw earlier, doesn't it?
It does. It does. It's interesting, though, this accusation against the Jews. It's here in chapter 9, but it's not something you see a lot throughout the Quran.
That does make you wonder about the historical and theological context behind it, like what specifically prompted these verses.
It reminds you, each chapter has its own focus, its own purpose. Understanding that context is so important for interpretation.
So much to think about. Okay, so far we've talked about breaking treaties, defining sacred spaces, putting God first, even navigating these theological differences. What's next in chapter 9?
Well, we shift from those weighty topics to something more poetic, more inspiring. This metaphor of God's light, you see it in verses 32, 33. This powerful image contrasting those who want to extinguish God's light with God's determination to let it shine.
And this light, it's obviously not a literal light, right? It's a symbol. But what does it stand for?
Some say it's the remembrance of God. Some connect it to the Quran itself, even divine knowledge.
I like that, like this multifaceted jewel reflecting different aspects of truth.
Exactly. And then how this light prevails, what does that look like? Worldly dominance. Something deeper. Verse 33, it talks about the prevalence of the true religion, but what does that word really mean?
Right, like is it about dominating on the Day of Judgment or simply making the message of Islam known throughout the world?
So much to ponder there. But even as the Quran celebrates this triumph of God's light, it also warns about getting too attached to worldly things. You see it in verses 38, 39.
A bit of a reality check, right? Don't get too focused on possessions or status. Some scholars tie this warning to the Tabuk expedition, Maybe some people didn't want to participate, not because of the heat or the long journey, but because their hearts were too attached to the comforts of this world.
It's all about priorities. God and his messenger first, not getting caught up in the allure of worldly things.
And those consequences for putting this life before the next one, they're pretty intense, at least according to verse 39.
For sure. It talks about punishment, even being replaced with another people who are more willing to put God first. It's a reminder, faith isn't just passive belief. It's an active commitment that shapes how we live. And then talk about powerful reminders. Chapter 9 shifts to this dramatic story of divine support for the Prophet. Verse 40, the account of the Prophet and Abu Bakr hiding in that cave during their escape from Makkah, and God sending down his tranquility and these unseen hosts, often interpreted as angels, to protect them.
Wow. It really captures what it means to have faith when you're facing danger, when everything's uncertain.
It's like a movie scene, right? The words of the disbelievers fading away while the word of God endures.
A message of hope, reassurance, especially after those warnings about hypocrisy and worldly attachment. But chapter 9 isn't done keeping us on our toes. Verses 53, 54, we're back to the theme of sincerity. But this time it's about giving freely versus giving reluctantly.
You ever see those people who do good deeds just to show off or get something in return? These verses call that out, plain and simple. True charity comes from the heart. not from wanting recognition or reward.
Aligning our actions with our intentions, making sure our good deeds come from a place of real faith and compassion.
Exactly. And this actually connects to a bigger idea that you see throughout the Quran, the idea that all of creation worships God, some willingly, some by their very nature.
It's a mind-blowing concept, isn't it? Like
Yeah.
true worship. It's not just rituals or outward displays. It's recognizing this interconnectedness of everything, our place within it all.
It is pretty profound, but let's not forget about those who struggle with hypocrisy, whose outward actions and inner doubts, they don't quite match up. Chapter 9 goes back to their world in verses 64-68. Their fear of being exposed, their attempts to downplay revelation, it's all there.
Like they can sense that their true thoughts and intentions might come out, and they're scared of what'll happen.
Yeah, they try to mock believers, dismiss the Quran's message, but you can tell deep down it's not really working for them.
It's like this glimpse into the mind of someone torn between faith and doubt. Maybe they do have some faith, but they're held back by envy, stubbornness, maybe even just fear of what other people think.
Right, right. Hypocrisy isn't always about intentionally deceiving others. Sometimes it's about battling with our own internal contradictions.
But chapter 9 doesn't leave us in that darkness.
Mhm.
Verse 71, this beautiful contrast. Believers as protectors of one another. This community of care, support, belonging.
This vision of an ideal society, bound by faith, compassion, commitment to living a righteous life, encouraging good, preventing wrong, praying together, giving alms, striving to follow God and his messenger. And it's not just men either. Verse 71 specifically says believing men and believing women protecting one another.
It highlights that egalitarian spirit, so important to the Islamic concept of community. But let's be real, chapter 9 doesn't shy away from conflict. Verse 73, this command to strive against the disbelievers and the hypocrites.
And that brings up the question, does it mean using force against both groups? Or are there different approaches depending on whether someone rejects the message of Islam or just pretends to accept it?
That's a big one, isn't it? It affects how Muslims engage with people of different beliefs, and people are still debating it today. And it's worth mentioning, other verses in the Quran do talk about being stern toward disbelievers. Adds another layer to think about.
Definitely. Interpreting the Quran, you have to consider the whole picture. Different verses might address different situations, different audiences.
And speaking of different situations, verses 90-91, we're back to seeking permission to stay behind from battle. But this time, it's about the Bedouin.
Like continuing that conversation we started earlier, right? All the different reasons someone might not be able to participate in armed struggle.
Yeah.
But these verses, they emphasize having sincere excuses.
Being honest with yourself, with God, about your limitations, about your willingness to sacrifice for your faith.
Exactly. And then there's this interesting concept introduced here, nasiha. It means sincere counsel and action.
It's like this holistic approach to righteousness, combining words and deeds.
Right. Being a true friend, offering guidance, offering support, ultimately helping others get closer to God. And it connects right back to the themes of repentance and sincere devotion that run through this whole chapter.
Faith isn't just about avoiding sin. It's about actively striving to be better, helping each other along the way. But chapter 9 doesn't just focus on individual struggles. Verses 113-118, it tackles this really sensitive communal issue, seeking forgiveness for those who die as idolaters.
That's a tough one. Can you pray for someone who died rejecting the belief in one God?
Yeah, it's not an easy question.
The chapter seems to say no, you can't seek forgiveness for idolaters once it's clear where they stood. But then there's the example of Abraham, a revered prophet in Islam.
That's what I was thinking about. Known for his unwavering faith in one God, but he still prayed for his father, who was an idolater.
It's a fascinating exception that actually strengthens the rule. The verses say, yeah, Abraham did seek forgiveness for his father, but they also point out that he eventually disowned his father when it became clear he was an enemy of God.
So even a prophet's plea for forgiveness has his limits.
It does. God's mercy is vast, but it also depends on our choices, our actions. And these verses, they tell another powerful story. 3 companions who missed a battle and were shunned by the community because they didn't have a good enough excuse.
Oh, wow.
It emphasizes how important honesty and accountability are, even when you're facing social pressure.
True faith isn't about just going along with the crowd. It's about making those tough choices, standing up for what's right, even when it's not popular.
And it leads perfectly into the next part of chapter 9. We circle back to this idea of following the prophet, especially in battle. Verse 120 really emphasizes that.
It's about leadership, obedience, the importance of those things within the Muslim community, but it does make you wonder who exactly this command applies to.
Right. Just the Prophet Muhammad? Or does it extend to leaders who came after him? And how do you reconcile this with verse 122, which seems to say that not all believers have to go into battle?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Why would some believers be allowed to stay behind?
That's where things get even more interesting. It's almost like verse 122 kind of cancels out that earlier command to follow the prophet into battle.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
It's a question that's been debated for centuries, and it's led to some pretty interesting interpretations. Some scholars argue that verse 122 actually replaces that earlier command, like a shift in the community's needs as it got bigger, stronger.
Makes sense. Things change, the needs change.
Right, but others see these verses, well, they see them working together.
There's not necessarily a contradiction.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Verse 120, it stresses how important it is to be ready, willing to answer the prophet's call to action. But then, verse 122, it recognizes that fulfilling that duty, it could take different forms depending on what's going on.
So why would some believers be allowed to stay behind?
Verse 122 highlights the need for constant learning, spiritual growth within the Muslim community. Acquiring knowledge, teaching others, it's just as important as fighting on the battlefield.
Balance, right. You need both, the warriors and the scholars.
Perfect way to put it. And the historical context, it gives us even more to think about. Some scholars believe this verse came about when large groups were converting to Islam. The idea being, not everyone needed to rush off to Medina right away.
Interesting.
Others connect it to the battles that were happening, the need for religious instruction even during wartime. And still others see it as a rebuke to those who criticize those who stay behind to teach, emphasizing the value of their work.
It's pretty amazing how one verse can have so many layers of meaning.
It speaks to that flexibility, that adaptability of the Quran's guidance, offering wisdom for all different times and situations.
And it ties in nicely with that idea of the prophet as a warner, mentioned in verse 122.
Yes, it's not just about getting the message yourself, it's about passing it on, making sure that chain of knowledge and guidance doesn't break.
Spreading outwards from the source, like ripples.
Exactly. But amidst all this talk of education and spiritual growth, Chapter 9 doesn't let us forget about that struggle against those who oppose the message of Islam. Verse 123, it brings us back to conflict, this command to fight the near enemy.
This feels familiar, but also kind of different. We talked about reasons for going to war, that idea of a just cause. But who exactly is this near enemy? Is it a specific group? Or is it more of a broader concept?
That's where interpretations get really interesting. Some scholars take it literally. They say it's about those geographically closest to the Muslim community, like maybe those Arab tribes who hadn't embraced Islam yet. But others, they see it as a more universal principle. It's about prioritizing those threats that pose the most immediate danger.
Okay, so it's about figuring out which battles to fight first, whether those battles are literal, on a battlefield, or battles of ideas.
Exactly. And there's another interpretation that I find especially thought-provoking. The idea that this near enemy could represent our own internal struggles.
Oh, I like that.
Like a call to conquer those temptations, the doubts, those negative tendencies that hold us back from growing spiritually.
Like the toughest battle is the one we fight within ourselves.
You got it. True victory starts with mastering yourself, conquering those inner demons. And speaking of inner struggles, verses 124, 127, they explore this fascinating paradox. The same revelation, the Word of God, it can have completely opposite effects on different people.
I've always wondered about that. How can some people find guidance, inspiration in the Quran, while others just become even more resistant?
These verses offer a glimpse into what's going on inside those whose hearts are hardened against the truth. It's almost like they're trying to shield themselves from something that threatens their whole way of thinking. So they downplay revelation, they mock believers, they cling to their own limited understanding.
It's like, I don't know, trying to force something that doesn't fit.
Yeah. Like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, it's just not going to work. No matter how hard you push, it reminds you, even the most profound truths, people can reject them, distort them if they're not willing to open their minds, their hearts. But even with all this talk of conflict and rejection, chapter 9 ends on a really beautiful note of compassion. Verses 128, 129, they show us the prophet's heart, his deep concern for his people, his unwavering trust in God.
I can almost feel the weight he's carrying, trying to guide people toward a path they don't want to take. It's a heavy burden.
It is. And yet, he doesn't give up hope. He turns to God for strength, for guidance.
It's a good reminder that even those chosen to deliver God's message, they're still human. They experience doubt, fear, frustration, just like everyone else.
That's so important to remember, but what sets them apart is that unwavering trust in God, that willingness to let go and surrender to his will.
And that surrender, it's so beautifully expressed in the prophet's declaration. God suffices me. There is no God but he. In him do I trust, and he is the Lord of the mighty throne.
It's a powerful statement of faith, of complete reliance on God, recognizing that ultimately our strength and guidings come from something bigger than ourselves. And it's a fitting way to end a chapter that's wrestled with conflict, faith, and all those complexities being human.
You know, what strikes me is how this last scene brings together so many of those threads we've been following throughout chapter 9. The need for both inner and outer struggle, that balance between action and contemplation, and ultimately finding peace and purpose in our relationship with God.
And it reminds us, even when things are tough, uncertain, we can always turn to God for guidance, support, for that sense of peace that helps us weather the storms.
It's a beautiful message.
Yeah.
And it feels like the right moment to pause, reflect on what we've learned so far. We covered a lot of ground, huh? In chapter 9, it's like this whirlwind of emotions, ideas, from battlefields to mosques, from theological debates to these like intimate moments with the prophet. Definitely not a chapter you can just, breeze through.
It makes you think, that's for sure. It challenges you to wrestle with these big questions about faith, forgiveness, what it really means to live a righteous life. It's not about easy answers or like simplifying things. It's about digging deep, peeling back those layers, discovering just how rich and complex the Quran's message really is.
And, something that kept coming up for me throughout our conversation was this focus on sincerity. It's not enough to just like go through the motions of religious practice.
Right, it has to be more than that.
It's about developing this real connection with God, one that shapes every thought, intention, action.
It's about that inner change that shows up in how you live, making sure your beliefs and your actions, they line up. And that's a message that goes way beyond chapter 9, even beyond Islam. It's something we all strive for, that authenticity, that integrity, living a life that reflects what we truly value.
With all the challenges we face these days, the division, the conflicts, the information overload, it's easy to get overwhelmed, to feel lost. But chapter 9, with its focus on inner strength, moral clarity, that unwavering trust in God, it almost feels like, a guide for navigating these crazy times.
It reminds us, even amidst the chaos, the uncertainty, there is a path forward, a way to find peace, purpose. And it starts by looking inward, cultivating that deep connection with the divine, and letting that connection lead the way.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into chapter 9, repentance, I'm feeling, kind of awestruck and inspired. Awestruck by just how deep and complex the Quran's message is, and inspired to keep striving for that sincerity, that inner change that can, spread outwards, make a difference in the world.
It's a journey that never really ends, right? Constantly learning, reflecting, refining our understanding. And chapter 9 is such a great place to begin that journey.
And as always, we encourage you, our listeners, to keep exploring this chapter for yourselves. Read it slowly. Let the words sink in. Ask yourselves, what stands out to you? What challenges you? What insights do you discover as you go deeper into its meaning?
The Quran, it's a book that rewards you when you really take the time to think about it, engage with it. It's full of wisdom, guidance, and it's meant to be studied, pondered, and lived.
Well said. And until next time, may you find peace, clarity, and inspiration on your own journey of faith and understanding.